out of my meeting! Right now! She's not a scientist. She's just the one who mixes the shakes. Everyone at this table knows it.
10:14 on a Tuesday morning, 9th floor of Mercy General and Adaeze stood frozen by the sideboard, the coffee carafe rattling faintly against its own lid in her shaking hand. Her face had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that comes right before someone either cries or stops breathing. For a long while, nobody in that room moved. The silence, after Renee's outburst, lasted only 4 seconds, though Adaeze would remember it later as something closer to a minute. It was the specific kind of silence that happens when 8 people in a room all decide at the same moment not to be the one who speaks first. Renee's chest was still heaving when she sat back down, smoothing the front of her blazer with both hands, and picked up the pitch exactly where she had left off, as if nothing had happened at all. Nobody at the table asked her to explain it. Nobody wanted to become the next thing she raised her voice about. Adaze's hands did not stop shaking until she had set the carafe down twice, picked it back up, and set it down a third time, finally steady. Marcus had been married to Renee for 7 years, long enough to know the particular silence that followed one of her outbursts, and long enough to have stopped trying to fill it. His eyes stayed fixed on the agenda in front of him, jaw tight, the pen in his hand turning over and over without writing anything at all. Around the table sat 4 people from Castellan Biotech's early-stage investment group, 2 men and 2 women, in the kind of blazers that cost more than Adaeze's monthly rent. None of them turned to look at the woman who had just been screamed at in front of them. Looking at her would have meant admitting what they had just watched. One associate, a young man with a legal pad, wrote something down, though what he wrote was Renee's projected revenue figure for year 3, not anything about the woman at the sideboard. Adaeze finished pouring the last cup and straightened the small stack of napkins beside the carafe and stayed exactly where she was. Leaving now would have looked like agreeing she should. Her hands out of sight below the table's edge had finally gone still. The particular stillness of someone counting instead of feeling. She had been counting for 2 years and 4 months, and she was not going to stop in front of people who had just watched her get screamed at like a stranger who wandered into the wrong meeting. What she did not know yet, standing at that sideboard with the carafe finally steady in her hand, was that the folder in front of Renee held 61 pages. Every number on every page had come from a hard drive that belonged to her. Back in her office, on the 3rd floor, the one with a window that looked out over the parking structure and not much else. Adaeze did not sit down. She opened her personal laptop, the one she had used for hundreds of nights of work. No one at Mercy General had ever asked her to do. She forwarded from her hospital email to a private account. The folder of dated file logs, the nutrition analytics platform, kept automatically for every user. The logs went back to the week she first opened a blank spreadsheet and started tracking micronutrient absorption rates in post-transplant children. It was not evidence yet. It was only a habit, the same habit that had made the protocol work in the first place. Write everything down, save every version, never trust memory with a number that mattered. She closed the laptop, put it back in her bag, and went to check on the 4 patients she was actually responsible for that morning. Whatever Renee was building in that conference room, none of it changed the fact that a 9-year-old on the 4th floor needed his feeding schedule adjusted before noon. A hospital tray with the plastic wrap still sealed had once sat untouched on a nightstand in a pediatric oncology room on the 6th floor. That was 4 years before the meeting in the conference room beside a 7-year-old named Marcus Webb, no relation to her own brother who had not eaten in 6 days. Adaeze was 29 that year, new to the unit, and she still remembers the exact weight loss the chart recorded that week: 4 pounds, on a body that did not have 4 pounds to spare. The attending physician had told the family there was nothing more nutrition could do for a child whose body was rejecting food faster than any formula on the market could replace it. Adaeze went home that night and pulled every study she could find on absorption pathways in post-chemotherapy children. Most of the studies were written for adults, none of them built for a 7-year-old's chemistry. The boy died 11 days later, and Adaeze kept the folder of studies she had printed that first night. Throwing it away had felt like agreeing that nothing more could have been done. For the next 2 years, she built her protocol on nights and weekends, using her own laptop and her own subscription to a biochemical modeling platform she paid for herself. She built a spreadsheet that eventually held absorption data from every pediatric oncology patient she was allowed to track under signed parental consent. By the time the protocol had a name, 61 children had gone through some version of it. The improvement in caloric retention during treatment was large enough that Dr. Yvonne Price, the hospital's chief of pediatric oncology, had stopped calling it Adaeze's project and started calling it the department's proudest quiet success. None of it had a patent, because for 2 years it had never occurred to Adaeze that it needed one. She had built it to keep another set of parents from hearing the sentence she had heard in that 6th-floor room not to build a company. That was the version of the story Renee had heard exactly once at a family dinner 18 months earlier. The version Renee had chosen to remember was only the number at the end of it. The Marrow Recovery Protocol. The name Dr. Price had given it before Adaeze settled on one herself, worked by sequencing nutrient delivery around a patient's specific chemotherapy cycle instead of following a single fixed feeding schedule. It front-loaded protein and specific amino acids in the 72-hour window after a dose when a child's gut lining was most compromised. Then it shifted to a calorie-dense low-residue formula during the nadir period when white blood cell counts bottomed out. Adaeze had coded the sequencing logic herself in a spreadsheet that eventually became software, simple enough for a night shift nurse to run without a dietitian standing over her shoulder. The software cross-referenced each child's weight, absolute neutrophil count, and specific chemotherapy regimen against a database built from 214 logged sessions of her own trial and error work. In the 61 children who had gone through some version of the protocol during its pilot years, average weight loss during induction chemotherapy had dropped by nearly 40% compared to the department's historical baseline. 2 attending oncologists had independently asked whether the hospital planned to publish it. The answer until 11 weeks ago had always been, not yet, because Adaeze was still refining the amino acid ratios for infants under 2, a population the early data did not yet support with confidence. That gap, the one honest, unfinished corner of 2 years of work, was the exact place Renee's version of the protocol, the one now sitting in a pale green folder, claimed to have already solved. Adaeze had never written that solution down anywhere because she had not found it yet. Every Friday afternoon, regardless of how many other things were on her calendar, Adaeze pulled 5 charts at random from the software's log and recalculated the sequencing numbers by hand. It was a habit she had kept since a decimal error in month 3 of the pilot had briefly overfed a 4-year-old by nearly double his tolerance. The error had been caught only because she happened to check that particular chart herself before the evening dose went out. That single near miss, corrected before it ever reached a patient, was the reason the protocol's software still required a manual sign-off field on every dosing calculation. The field carried her initials more than 2,000 times over 2 years and 4 months. No investor deck had ever mentioned the manual sign-off field because nobody pitching a company to Castellan Biotech thought a spreadsheet checkbox was worth a slide. It was, in its own quiet way, the actual proof of who had spent 2 years making sure the numbers were safe enough to trust. David Cho had been CEO of Mercy General for 11 weeks when he first noticed Adaeze, and it was not in a conference room or at a gala. It was at 6:40 in the morning in the hospital's sub-basement server room, where he had gone against the advice of every person on his executive team. He wanted to personally review how the hospital's clinical data systems were structured before he signed off on a vendor contract that would have changed all of it. Adaeze was already there, sitting on an overturned crate with a laptop balanced on her knees, running a batch export of 2 years of nutrient absorption logs. An overnight system migration was about to wipe the staging server, and IT had told her the migration would preserve everything. She had learned the hard way twice not to trust that sentence from anyone. "You're not supposed to be down here without a ticket," David said, more curious than official about it. "Neither are you," she said without looking up, and kept typing. He watched her for a full 2 minutes before she noticed him again. Watched the particular economy of someone whose hands moved faster than her attention needed to. He found himself less interested in who she was than in why a data export mattered enough to bring her down to a server room before sunrise. When she finally told him in 4 flat sentences exactly what the migration would have cost 61 families if it had gone wrong, he understood 2 things. She was the most careful person he had met in 11 weeks of interviewing directors who used the word synergy without irony, and whatever she was protecting, it was not her own reputation. He asked Dr. Price about her the next morning carefully, the way a new CEO learns to ask about anyone without starting a rumor. What Dr. Price told him sent him back to reread a line item buried on page 40 of the hospital's development office budget. That line item requested board approval for a spin-off company called Meridian Nutraceuticals. The name attached to the request was not Adaeze Bennett's. It was Renee's, and the projected valuation on the request had been quietly revised upward twice in the 6 weeks since he had started. Renee found out about the protocol's real scope by accident, in the way most quiet things get discovered inside a hospital. It happened through a budget meeting she was not technically supposed to be in. 6 weeks before that, Tuesday morning, the hospital's finance committee had reviewed a proposal from Dr. Price to formally fund an expansion of the Bennett nutrient sequencing protocol. The minutes described it as currently self-funded by staff dietitian A. Bennett pilot data covering 61 patients over 3 years. Renee, sitting in as a note-taker for the development office, underlined that line twice and then spent the rest of the meeting saying nothing at all. She went home that night and did what she was by training actually good at. She pulled every public conference presentation Dr. Price had ever given that mentioned the protocol and cross-referenced them against the hospital's internal grant database. In 11 days, she built a business case clean enough to survive due diligence from anyone who did not already know who had done the underlying work. She did not in those 11 days ask Adaeze a single question about any of it. She told herself this omission did not count as a decision the way people tell themselves that about decisions they have already made. Renee had spent 9 years in hospital business development, watching other people's ideas get funded around her, while her own pitch decks quietly died in committee. What she felt reading that budget line was not admiration, it was the specific unfairness of watching someone who had never once asked for a promotion sit on something worth a fortune. By the end of the 11 days, she had a slide deck and evaluation model built entirely on the 61 patient outcomes from Dr. Price's minutes. She had a company name, too, chosen for how well it would read on a pitch page, Meridian Nutraceuticals. The one thing she did not have was a single line of underlying research she had generated herself. She solved that problem the way she solved every hard problem in her career, by deciding that ownership was a matter of who filed the paperwork first. The theft itself took 11 minutes and did not require anyone to break anything. Renee's role in business development already gave her read access to the platform where Adaeze had spent 2 years and 4 months logging results, the same MedNutri analytics platform that had almost lost everything in that server migration. On a Thursday night, 11:47 p.m., Renee sat alone in her office with the lights off except for the glow of the monitor, her reflection faint in the dark window behind her. Her hands did not shake the way they would later in that conference room. They moved fast and sure, the way hands move when a person has already decided not to think too hard about what they are doing. She logged into the platform using her own hospital credentials. Credentials she was authorized to use for a dozen legitimate reasons, and none of the reasons she used them for that night. She exported the full dataset behind the marrow recovery protocol, sequencing logic, amino acid ratios, 214 logged sessions, all 61 patient outcome curves stripped of names but not of the years of work behind them. 2 days later, she filed a provisional patent application with the Federal Patent Office listing Meridian Nutraceuticals as the assignee and herself as the sole inventor. She attached to the assignment of invention paperwork a signature page pulled from Adaeze's original hospital onboarding file 5 years earlier, the standard form every new hire signed, agreeing that inventions made using hospital resources belong to the hospital. It was a document Renee's legal consultant had told her correctly would read to an outside investor as proof the chain of ownership was clean. It was not a forgery in the sense of a new signature drawn by hand. It was worse in a way that would matter later, a real signature attached to the wrong claim on a document that said nothing false on its own, and everything false in the context Renee had built around it. The filing fee was $1,687 paid from the Meridian Nutraceuticals account. Renee had opened 9 days earlier with money from her and Marcus's joint savings. Adaeze did not receive a notification because provisional patent applications do not require the named inventor's separate consent to file only a signature establishing rights. The signature attached was 5 years old, buried in a personnel file nobody thought to flag. By the time the filing was complete, the only trace of what had happened lived in 2 places. One was a federal database that would not be searchable by the public for 18 months. The other was a single login entry timestamped 11:47 p.m., sitting quietly inside a system Renee did not know kept a permanent record of every account that ever touched it. Adaeze found out 3 weeks later. Not from Renee and not from the hospital, but from a colleague at a nutrition science conference in Chicago. Over a hotel breakfast buffet, the colleague mentioned how interesting it was that Meridian Nutraceuticals had filed on a sequencing approach that sounded exactly like the poster Adaeze had presented at the same conference 2 years earlier. Adaeze's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and she set it down slowly, carefully, the way she handled everything when her hands wanted to shake and she would not let them. She did not say anything at the breakfast table. She flew home that night 4 hours earlier than her return ticket and went straight to her apartment instead of the hospital. What she needed first was not a confrontation, it was certainty, and certainty was not something she had ever gotten by raising her voice. Over the next 9 days, working after her shifts and before her shifts and twice during a lunch break, she was not technically owed. Adaeze built a file of her own. It held every version history timestamp from her personal cloud backup going back 2 years and 4 months. Every email she had ever sent Dr. Price with a spreadsheet attached and the signed consent forms for all 61 patients. She had learned long ago never to trust a system that told her data was safe. So she also filed a formal written records request to Mercy General's IT department for her own complete MedNutri analytics platform. Login history submitted through the hospital's standard employee data access process. This closed the question that had been sitting under everything since the conference breakfast, the one she had carried home on the plane without letting herself name it out loud. It was not a coincidence, and it was not a misunderstanding, and it had a shape now, a shape made of dates she could prove. She did not tell Marcus. She did not tell Renee. She told exactly one person, Dr. Price, on a Tuesday afternoon in an office with the door closed. She laid out the timeline in the same flat, careful voice she used for reporting a medication error, because in her experience, calm was the only tone anyone with power actually listened to. Dr. Price listened without interrupting, then asked a single question. Adaeze want this handled quietly inside the family? Or did she want it handled the way the hospital would handle any other theft of clinical intellectual property through legal and compliance? Adaeze said she needed 48 hours to think about it. What she did with those 48 hours was not think exactly. It was keep collecting. The one thing she had learned from 61 children and their charts was that hoping a number gets better on its own is not a strategy. Neither is hoping a person changes their mind before their business plan closes its funding round. The anomaly Adaeze found on day 7 of her own quiet audit was small enough that anyone else might have missed it. The assignment of invention page attached to the provisional patent carried her real signature, and she was able to view it once the filing became visible in a preliminary database search. The document date placed it 5 years before she had ever developed a single line of the sequencing logic it claimed to cover. It was on its face, the strongest piece of evidence Renee had the one meant to prove the hospital, not Adaeze, held original rights. But a signature dated 5 years before an invention exists is not proof of ownership. It is proof of exactly one thing, that whoever attached it either did not understand what they were looking at or was counting on nobody looking closely enough to ask. Adaeze photographed the document date with her phone and saved it in a folder she had started calling privately Exhibit 1. She did not yet know that somewhere on the 9th floor, a person she had never spoken to more than twice was about to start asking the same question from a completely different direction. She also did not yet know that the MedNutri analytics platform logged not just what was exported, but who exported it. That record, unlike the assignment page, could not be backdated by anyone because it was written automatically in real time to a server the hospital's IT department did not let any single employee touch. The second strike came in a Monday morning department meeting in front of 11 colleagues. Renee stood at the front of the room in a blazer she had clearly chosen for the occasion. Spine, straight voice, pitched low and clinical. Nothing at all like the woman who had screamed 2 weeks earlier. Presenting what she called a compliance update, arranged in advance with the hospital's legal liaison, she announced that an internal review had found irregularities in how nutrition department staff were logging patient data outside approved systems. She said out of an abundance of caution, one staff member's independent research files were being flagged pending review. She did not say Adaeze's name. She did not have to. Everyone in the room, including Adaeze, understood exactly whose files had just been publicly described in front of people she worked with every day as a compliance concern. Adaeze's face did not move at all, not a flicker, though her fingers folded in her lap under the table had gone white at the knuckles. Dr. Price sitting. 2 seats down, watched Adaeze's face for a reaction and saw none, which worried her more than tears would have. Within an hour, Adaeze's remote access to the MedNutri analytics platform, the system holding 2 years and 4 months of her own research, had been temporarily suspended pending the review Renee had just announced. On paper, it was standard procedure. In practice, it was the single most effective way to make Adaeze look to anyone watching like the problem, instead of the person the problem had happened to. For 3 days, Adaeze worked from printouts and her own backed-up files, adjusting feeding protocols for 4 active patients by hand. She double-checked every calculation twice because the system that normally caught her errors no longer trusted her enough to let her log in. She said nothing about it to anyone outside the department, and she said nothing to Renee at all. Not at the meeting, and not in the hallway afterward. She said nothing at the family dinner that Sunday either, where Marcus asked twice if everything was okay, and Adaeze said it was. She had decided somewhere in those 3 days that the version of this story where she yelled in a conference room was a version Renee would win. The version where she said nothing and kept a folder growing quietly on a hard drive was not. What Renee did not know, standing at the front of that meeting, was that the suspension of Adaeze's account access had done exactly one thing for Adaeze's case, and nothing for Renee's. It had created in the hospital's own compliance system a time-stamped official record of exactly which files existed under exactly whose name on the exact date before anyone in that room had a reason to doubt whose research it was. David had spent the 6 weeks since the server room conversation doing what he had learned in 11 weeks of being a new CEO to do carefully nothing visible. He pulled the original budget line himself and cross-referenced the 61-patient pilot data, cited in Dr. Price's committee minutes against the projected outcomes in Meridian Nutraceuticals' investor deck. A colleague on the finance committee had, at his quiet request, forwarded him that deck under the pretense of routine board due diligence. The numbers matched almost exactly closely enough that no independent research effort could plausibly have arrived at them separately. I had also 3 days earlier learned about the account suspension from an IT ticket that crossed his desk, only because he had asked weeks before to be copied on any compliance action involving the nutrition analytics platform. It was a request he had made for reasons he had not fully admitted to himself until he read Adaeze's name on it. He closed his laptop that night with a decision made, but not yet acted on, because acting too early on suspicion instead of documentation would hand Renee exactly the kind of overreach she could use. She could use it to make him look like he was protecting a favorite instead of following evidence. What he needed now was not a hunch. He needed the one thing Adaeze already had a partial version of and did not yet know. He was also looking for a record that could not have been altered after the fact. David did not go to Adaeze directly, though. Every instinct from 6 weeks of quiet attention told him to. He had learned in 11 weeks running a hospital that ran mostly fine without him that the fastest way to undermine someone handling a crisis competently was to walk in and start handling it for her. That was especially true when the someone in question had already built on her own the beginnings of exactly the record he needed. Instead, he asked General Counsel Priya Anand, a 19-year veteran of hospital compliance work, to open a formal documented review of the MedNutri analytics platform's access logs for the prior 28 months. He framed it not as an investigation into Renee, but as a routine security audit following the Meridian Nutraceuticals funding announcement, the kind of audit any responsible CEO would order before a hospital-adjacent spin-off closed an outside investment round. The framing mattered. It meant the audit could proceed through the hospital's normal legal channels with subpoena-proof documentation without ever tipping into something that looked to Renee or to anyone watching like a CEO abusing his position. I was against his own better judgment, starting to think about Adaeze as more than an org chart technically allowed. Adaeze never knew in those 4 days that anyone above her department was doing anything at all. The lever. David actually had, once the access log audit confirmed what Adaeze already suspected, was not dramatic. It was exactly the kind of lever a hospital CEO legitimately holds every hospital-affiliated spin-off company, including Meridian Nutraceuticals, operated under a mandatory data use and licensing agreement with Mercy General. That agreement governed anything built on hospital systems patient data or hospital-funded research, and Renee had signed it on Meridian's behalf 9 weeks earlier without reading Section 14 closely enough. Section 14 required the hospital's general counsel to certify in writing that no unresolved intellectual property dispute existed involving the underlying research before any hospital-affiliated spin-off could close outside funding using hospital-derived data. It was a standard clause meant to protect the hospital from exactly this kind of liability. Once Priya Anand's audit turned up a login record that flatly contradicted Meridian's ownership claim, she had both the authority and, under the hospital's own compliance policy, the obligation to withhold that certification. That meant Castellan Biotech's legal team, as a condition of the funding round they were about to close, would have to be formally notified that the certification could not be issued. This took David and Priya 4 days to prepare properly, not because the underlying facts were complicated, but because a false or premature notification would have exposed the hospital to its own liability. Priya had insisted correctly on giving Renee's attorney a standard 48-hour window to respond to the discrepancy before anything went to the investors. Renee's attorney never used that window because Renee did not tell him the full timeline of the 11:47 p.m. login until it was already too late to matter. Nobody froze a bank account. Nobody called in a favor from a friend in law enforcement. A licensing agreement Renee herself had signed simply did what it was written to do 4 days after David asked the one question that had been sitting unopened in a compliance folder. The question was simple: who else had logged into that system in the last 28 months, and when? David's own reasons for caring about a pediatric nutrition protocol ran deeper than good governance, though he had not said this to anyone at the hospital, including Adaeze. 24 years earlier, when he was 15, his younger sister Sophie had died of complications from leukemia treatment, not from the leukemia itself, but from a body too depleted by 6 months of chemotherapy to fight off a routine infection. The hospital at the time had called it in the flat language of a discharge summary treatment-related nutritional compromise. 4 words his mother had never once repeated out loud in the 24 years since. Grace Cho kept a small framed photograph of Sophie on a shelf in the family's kitchen beside a bowl she filled every September 4th. Sophie's birthday with seaweed soup made exactly the way her own mother had made it. It was a ritual she performed alone before sunrise and never explained to anyone who had not already understood why. As the eldest son, David had been raised to inherit his father's construction supply company, not to run a hospital. The year he told his parents he was leaving that path for hospital administration, his mother had not spoken to him for 11 days. Not out of cruelty, but out of a grief she did not have other language for. It was the sense that he was walking away from the one kind of certainty their family had left. He had never told anyone at Mercy General why a nutrition protocol for children in chemotherapy mattered to him more than the other 40 items on his first-year priority list. He did not plan to tell Adaeze either. It was not a secret exactly, but he had learned that saying it out loud made people treat him differently, more carefully, in a way that felt like pity dressed as respect. Grace Cho found out about the funding dispute the same week David did not, because he told her, but because she still kept a subscription to the local business journal. It was a habit from 30 years running the family's own small business. The journal had run a 2-paragraph item on Meridian Nutraceuticals' upcoming Castellan pitch. She called David that Sunday and asked him in Korean the way she asked him anything she considered serious. She wanted to know whether the woman the article vaguely credited to hospital staff was the same woman he had mentioned in passing over the past 2 months. David, who had learned there was no version of deflecting his mother that actually worked, said that she was. Grace did not lecture him about the hospital's politics, which surprised him, and instead asked only one question: did this woman cook? The question was not about food. It was the question Grace had asked about every person David had ever brought near the family, going back to a girlfriend in college, whose name Grace still would not say out loud. It meant something closer to whether Adaeze understood the difference between doing a thing correctly and doing it for show. David told his mother that Adaeze recalculated dosing charts by hand every Friday, even though the software already did the math, because she did not trust a number she had not checked herself. Grace was quiet on the phone for a moment, then said that this was, in her experience, the only kind of person worth trusting with anything that mattered. She hung up without saying goodbye, which from Grace was its own kind of approval. She showed up at the hospital 11 days later, unannounced, with a covered dish she left at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, addressed to no one in particular. It was a habit from a lifetime of believing that feeding people who were suffering was a language that did not require an introduction first. Adaeze never learned who had left it, though she noted professionally that whoever made it had gotten the sodium content exactly right for a ward full of children on restricted diets. That was either an extraordinary coincidence or someone who had done their research. The closest David and Adaeze came to acknowledging any of it directly happened on the third of the 4 days in the hospital cafeteria at 7 in the morning. Ha sat 2 tables away with a folder he did not open, and she sat with a folder she did not open either. Both of them worked through the same 28 months of data from opposite directions without a single word passing between them. He noticed she took her coffee black and ate the same thing every morning, plain oatmeal with a small container of blueberries she brought from home instead of buying the cafeteria's version. He noticed on the 4th morning that she had started bringing 2 containers instead of 1, though she never offered him either. She noticed that he read every document twice before setting it down, the second pass slower than the first, the way someone reads something they are planning to defend later under questioning. She noticed that he left the cafeteria at exactly 7:40 every morning to walk the 4th floor before his first meeting. It was not because anyone required it of him, but because it was the floor where the pediatric oncology patients stayed, and he walked it slowly, reading names on doors he had no professional reason to know. Neither of them said the word meridian out loud in that cafeteria not once in 4 mornings. It was not avoidance. It was 2 people who had each independently decided that talking about it before either of them had proof would turn a fact-finding process into a feeling, and neither one trusted feelings yet with something that mattered this much. The piece that finally closed the case came from Adaeze, not David, on the morning of the 4th day. Her formal records request to IT was finally fulfilled, and she received in a single encrypted email her own complete MedNutri Analytics platform access history. It held 214 logged sessions across 28 months, every one of them stamped with her employee ID, her device, and in most cases a timestamp between 6 and 11 at night after her shifts ended. Attached to that same export was a single additional entry included because the IT specialist who ran the report had on his own initiative included every account that had ever touched the specific dataset behind the marrow recovery protocol. It was 1 login, 1 export, 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, 9 weeks earlier, under an employee ID that was not Adaeze's. Her hand went still over the trackpad. She recognized the ID immediately because she had seen it 100 times on shared department memos. It was Renee's. Adaeze sat with that email open for 11 full minutes before she did anything else. It was not because she needed to confirm what she already knew. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes from watching a suspicion turn all at once into a fact with a timestamp on it. Then she forwarded the export to exactly 1 address. Priya Anand's, with a subject line that contained no accusation at all, only 4 words requesting confirmation of attached. Priya's reply came back within the hour, confirming what the platform's engineering documentation had already told David days earlier. The login system wrote its access records to a separate automatically mirrored server the moment any account touched it, a design meant to satisfy federal data security audits, not office politics. No user, not even someone with Renee's administrative credentials, had ever had the ability to edit or delete an entry after the fact. The record from 11:47 p.m. was permanent. What remained now was smaller than proving the fact. It was choosing the room where the fact would finally be said out loud. Priya already knew from the calendar invite sitting unopened in her inbox exactly which room that would be the 9th floor conference room 2 days from now, 10 o'clock, the second and final pitch meeting with Castellan Biotech. 2 days later, the 9th floor conference room filled again. At 10 o'clock, the same table, the same 4 people from Castellan Biotech, the same pale green folder. This time it was joined by a second folder, dark blue, sitting closed in front of Priya Anand at the far end of the table. Marcus was there again too, seated beside Renee, still not entirely comfortable in the role of supportive spouse at a pitch meeting for a company built on his sister's work. He had not yet let himself say that sentence to anyone, including himself. David sat at the head of the table this time, not at the side where he had stood 11 weeks earlier during his first week. Adaeze stood near the sideboard again, in the same spot, holding a carafe she had not been asked to bring because old habits are hard to break even on a morning that was going to break several other things. Renee opened the meeting the way she had opened the first one, with a confident summary of Meridian's pilot outcomes. 61 patients, 40% reduction in weight loss during induction chemotherapy. This time her voice was measured almost gentle, a careful distance from the woman who had screamed 2 weeks earlier, though. Her hand kept finding the edge of the table and gripping it, releasing it, gripping it again. She recited the numbers from memory because she had practiced them enough times that they no longer felt like they belonged to someone else. When one of the Castellan associates asked almost as an afterthought whether the hospital's own nutrition staff had been involved in developing the underlying data, Renee answered without hesitation. She told them in the same tone she had used at the first meeting that Meridian had worked with hospital personnel only in a limited data collection capacity. Nothing that would complicate ownership. She said any suggestion otherwise was the kind of internal noise every growing company had to manage from people who felt threatened by success they had not achieved themselves. She did not look at Adaeze when she said it, though everyone else in the room did briefly before looking away. It was David, thought watching from the head of the table, the same sentence dressed in nicer clothes than the one Renee had said in this same room 2 weeks earlier. This time it was translated for an audience she needed to impress, instead of an audience she felt safe insulting directly. Underneath the translation, it was the identical claim that the work belonged to whoever had the confidence to stand up and describe it as theirs. The associates from Castellan, sensing nothing, yet kept their pens moving, still recording numbers that were about to stop being usable for anything. Adaeze set the carafe down on the sideboard quietly, and for the first time in either meeting, she did not immediately step back toward the door. Priya Anand had spent 19 years learning exactly when to let a false claim finish being spoken before correcting it. She waited until Renee reached the sentence about future licensing revenue before she opened the dark blue folder in front of her. She did not raise her voice, and she did not address Renee directly at first. She addressed the table the way lawyers learn to address a room instead of a person when the person is about to become a problem for everyone in it. She placed the dark blue folder in the center of the table and turned it so the tab faced the Castellan associates rather than herself. She opened it to the first of 3 sections she had prepared, each one separated by a yellow tab, the kind used in litigation files, to mark exhibits a jury would need to find quickly. The first section was a printed spreadsheet, 61 rows each one, patient. Outcome from the Marrow Recovery Protocol's pilot years, cross-referenced against the identical 61 rows in Meridian's own investor deck. The numbers on both pages matched to the decimal point, a level of precision Priya noted in the same even tone that no 2 independently conducted research efforts had ever achieved by coincidence. The second section was the assignment of invention page from the provisional patent filing, the one Renee's attorney had presented as clean chain of title. It sat photographed beside a second document showing the actual date the sequencing protocol had first been developed, a date 5 years after the signature on the assignment page. Priya described the gap without embellishment as a documented impossibility. Renee's face had gone very white, though her mouth stayed pressed into a thin, determined line, the look of someone still trying to calculate a way out of a room she had not yet realized had no exit. The third section, the one Priya opened last, was a single page, the access log from the MedNutri Analytics platform, formatted the way the system generated it automatically without edits and without commentary. It listed 214 entries under one employee ID spanning 28 months and one entry, 11:47 p.m., under a different ID, entirely the export that had produced the exact numbers now sitting in Meridian's deck. The exhibit page listed each entry across 6 columns: employee ID, device identifier, IP address, timestamp, action taken, and file hash. It was the file hash column more than any other that closed the argument because the hash generated at 11:47 p.m. matched character for character. The hash embedded in Meridian's own investor deck. That match was proof the numbers in Renee's pitch had never been separately calculated at all, only copied. Priya turned the final page so it faced Renee, not the investors, and let the room read the 2 employee ID numbers side by side in silence for longer than was comfortable. Marcus, who had said almost nothing in either meeting, reached for the folder before Priya could close it and turned it toward himself. He read the 2 employee ID numbers, the way a person reads a lab result they already suspect will confirm the worst thing they have been avoiding for weeks. He set it back down without a word, and the particular quiet way he did it told David more about where the marriage stood than any conversation could have. One of the Castellan associates. The one who had asked the original question about hospital staff involvement leaned over to examine the access log page more closely. He asked Priya directly whether the log's timestamp server could theoretically be spoofed by someone with sufficiently high administrative privileges. Priya had anticipated the question because it was the one question that could have reopened the entire meeting. She answered it the way she had prepared. To the platform's timestamp server was maintained by a third-party compliance vendor under a federal healthcare data contract entirely separate from Mercy General's internal IT department. No employee of the hospital, including Renee, including David, including Priya herself, had ever held the credentials required to alter it. The associate nodded once, made a note, and did not ask again. Adaeze watched from the sideboard as he closed his laptop, and she found herself thinking of all things about the 4-year-old whose overfed dose she had caught in month 3 of the pilot. Both moments had come down to the exact same thing, a number checked carefully enough by someone who refused to assume it was already right. She did not smile. She refilled the water glasses closest to her out of a habit 4 years deep, and for the first time in either meeting, one of the Castellan associates said thank you when she did it. The room's silence broke first with numbers, the layer Priya had led with, because numbers are the layer investors trust most and challenge least. The 61 patient outcomes in Meridian's deck were not similar to the hospital's pilot data. They were the pilot data exported wholesale on a single night 9 weeks earlier and never independently regenerated. Every projection Castellan had been preparing to fund rested on research Meridian Nutraceuticals had never actually conducted. The second layer was documentary, and it was the layer that turned discomfort into liability. The assignment of invention page, the one piece of paper meant to prove the hospital's ownership chain ran clean, undermined itself the moment anyone checked the date against the invention it claimed to cover. It was a 5-year gap that a patent examiner, a Castellan compliance officer, or eventually a federal investigator conducting fraud review would find in minutes, not months. The third layer was the one Renee had not anticipated because she had made one specific quiet miscalculation 9 weeks earlier. She had assumed a system built for clinical data security logged activity the way most office software did. Informally deletable a record she could have cleared if she had thought to ask an engineer instead of assuming. Priya now read aloud from the final exhibit page word for word what Renee had not known. The MedNutri analytics platform mirrored every access record in real time to a federal compliant write-once server the moment it was created, specifically because the hospital handled protected pediatric health data. That meant the 11:47 p.m. entry under Renee's employee ID had been permanent, unchangeable, and waiting since the exact second she created it. That was the answer to the question that had been sitting under the entire meeting since Adaeze first opened that email 4 days earlier. Renee had not been reckless in any way that mattered to her. She had simply never imagined that a hospital system logging feeding schedules for sick children was also silently keeping a perfect record of the one night she had needed it not to. She had built an entire company on the confident, specific belief that nobody checks the access logs on a nutrition database. She had been wrong by exactly one system administrator's design decision made 2 years before she ever logged in. Renee's hands flat on the table had started shaking again. The same shaking from 2 weeks earlier, except this time nobody in the room mistook it for anger. Castellan's lead associate closed her laptop not out of anger, but out of the particular caution investors develop after watching one funding round collapse in a conference room. She said evenly that the firm would need to withdraw from the closing pending its own independent review. That sentence ended, for all practical purposes, Meridian Nutraceuticals' path to the $1,487,320 it had been 11 days from securing. Renee did not argue with the exhibit pages. She looked instead at the employee ID number on the final page for a long moment, as though checking it a second time might change what it said, and it did not. 10 days earlier, in this same room at this same table, Renee had said it plainly. She's not a scientist. She's just the one who mixes the shakes. Nobody at that first meeting had corrected her. Nobody needed to correct her now. The 214 access log entries under Adaze's employee ID were on their own, a more complete scientific record than anything Meridian Nutraceuticals had ever filed with the Federal Patent Office. 28 months of dated, time-stamped, verifiable work had been sitting there, unclaimed by anyone but her, the entire time Renee had been building a company on top of it. Adaeze did not say any of this out loud. She did not need to. The exhibit pages had already said it more precisely than she could have in the specific unglamorous language of timestamps and employee IDs. That was in the end the same language she had trusted for 2 years and 4 months instead of trusting a room to notice her on its own. She set the coffee carafe down on the sideboard one more time, and this time she did not walk toward the door. What happened to Renee over the following weeks was not dramatic in the way television made corporate fraud look. It was procedural and slower, and in its own way more permanent. Castellan Biotech's compliance team formally referred the assignment of invention discrepancy to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office within 5 business days. That referral would trigger a federal review of the provisional filing rather than an immediate criminal charge, since patent fraud investigations. David's own counsel reminded him typically run months, not days. The referral required the office's own examiners to build a case methodically rather than react to a single meeting. Mercy General's board, acting on Priya's recommendation, terminated Renee's employment the same week, effective immediately. It was a decision within the board's direct authority as her employer under the hospital's own compliance policy over any employee found to have exported protected clinical research data without authorization, and it required no outside agency's involvement at all. Meridian Nutraceuticals, with its funding withdrawn and its sole claimed asset now under federal review, dissolved within 6 weeks. Nobody forced it to. A company with no product, no funding, and an open patent fraud referral has in practice nothing left to be a company with. Marcus moved out of the house he and Renee had shared for 7 years. 2 months later, a fact Adaeze learned from their mother rather than from him. She did not ask him about it directly because some things inside a family take longer to say out loud than a courtroom takes to decide anything. The question of what would happen once the fact was finally said out loud in that room closed quietly days after the meeting ended in the same cafeteria where David and Adaeze had once sat 2 tables apart without speaking. This time they sat at the same table, and for the first few minutes neither of them mentioned Meridian or the patent office or the board's decision. Both of them had spent 2 weeks talking about almost nothing else with people whose job it was to talk about it. David asked instead about the amino acid ratios. She still had not finished for children under 2, the one unresolved corner of 2 years of work. Adaeze found herself explaining it in more detail than she had explained it to anyone since Dr. Price, not because he needed to understand the biochemistry. It was because he was the first person in a long time who had asked about the actual work instead of the story around it. 6 months after the meeting in the 9th floor conference room, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office formally rejected Meridian Nutraceuticals' provisional application and referred the assignment of invention discrepancy for further review. David's counsel estimated the process would take another year to fully close, though its practical outcome had already been decided the day Castellan withdrew. Mercy General's board, at Dr. Price's formal request, and with David's full support, filed a new provisional patent application in Adaeze's name alone. This time, the assignment of invention agreement was drafted by Priya Anand herself when Adaeze read in full twice before signing anything. The hospital retained a licensing interest in the Marrow Recovery Protocol standard for research developed using institutional resources and patient data. The agreement guaranteed Adaeze both inventor credit and a royalty structure on any future commercial licensing. Priya had insisted on those terms specifically because of what the prior 9 weeks had shown her about what happens when that kind of agreement is left vague. Renee's employment termination remained on her permanent hospital record, and the federal patent fraud referral remained open. Neither of them resolved in the tidy, immediate way a single conference room meeting might suggest. Real consequences. David had learned in his first year as CEO mostly arrive on their own slower schedule. The amino acid ratios for children under 2. The one gap. Adaeze had never closed. In 2 years of independent work, took her another 11 months to finish properly. This time she had hospital funding, a dedicated research assistant, and approval that let her expand the pilot to 2 other children's hospitals in different states. The expanded protocol was published under her name in a peer-reviewed pediatric oncology journal 14 months after the meeting that had almost cost her everything. It reported outcomes across 189 patients, and the improvement in caloric retention held steady at just under 40%. That number no longer belonged to anyone's investor deck, only to the paper's method section and the families who read it. 2 other children's hospitals adopted the protocol within the year using a licensing structure Adaeze had helped design herself. The structure ensured any hospital using her research paid a modest fee that funded exactly one thing: continued development of the protocol for the population it still did not fully serve. Among the first patients treated under the protocol's expanded amino acid formula was a 14-month-old named Iris Delgado. Her oncologist had told her parents in the same kind of flat clinical language Adaeze remembered from the 6th floor room 9 years earlier that infants under 2 tolerated aggressive chemotherapy poorly enough that weight loss during induction was simply expected. Iris finished her induction cycle having gained 6 ounces instead of losing the 1.5 pounds her oncologist had projected. Her mother, who had found Adaze's name through the hospital's patient-family network rather than through any press coverage of the Castellan meeting, mailed her a card that said only "thank you for checking the numbers." Adaeze kept that card taped inside her office desk drawer face down, where she could see it only when she was looking for something else. She was 36 by the time the second hospital signed on. A reporter from a regional health publication asked her during a brief phone interview. She almost declined how it felt to have built something that important. She said only that it felt the way most of the actual work had always felt. It was quiet and slow and worth doing whether or not anyone in a conference room happened to be watching that day. On a Tuesday evening in late September, Adaeze stood in David's kitchen, the late light coming low and gold through the window over the sink. She measured rice into a pot with the specific, unhurried attention she brought to every measurement that mattered to her. It was the kind of ordinary evening that had become over the past year more common than either of them had expected when it started. She was at the stove. He was setting the table with the same care he brought to reading a document twice, the two of them moving around each other in a kitchen neither had planned to share. It was a rhythm that had built itself slowly out of 100 small evenings like this one. On the counter beside the stove sat a small bowl, not yet filled, that Adaeze had started keeping for a September ritual she had learned about only in the past year. Without being asked, she had begun to help prepare it. Seaweed soup made the way Grace Cho had taught her patiently over 2 visits that had started stiff. By the second visit, it had ended with Grace correcting Adaeze's knife technique with the specific bluntness of a woman who had decided finally that this was someone worth teaching properly. David came in from the hallway, loosened his tie, and without a word began setting 3 places instead of 2, because his mother was coming for dinner in an hour. Some things about the evening did not need discussing anymore. They had simply become how things were done. Grace arrived exactly on time, as she always did. Carrying a small white envelope she pressed into Adaeze's hands at the door. It was the way she had once pressed one into David's hands on the day he left for his first job. A gesture Adaeze had learned not to open in front of her. The amount inside was never the point, only the fact of the giving. Inside the envelope, Adaeze already knew without looking would be exactly enough cash to cover one specific thing this time, the last remaining supply order for the pediatric ward's expanded feeding program. Grace had asked about that supply order specifically, and without embarrassment the last time the 3 of them had eaten together. She had decided somewhere in the past year that this was now, in the plain and practical way her own mother had once measured such things, family business. At the table before anyone ate, Grace filled David's cup first, then Adaeze's, using both hands the way she had used them her whole life for anyone she considered worth the gesture. She set the seaweed soup down last in the center of the table, though Sophie's birthday was 6 weeks away yet. Some years, she said, a family earns the right to eat it early. It would be easy to end this story with the patent office or the board meeting or the 6 weeks it took Meridian Nutraceuticals to dissolve into nothing, because those are the parts with clean dates and clear winners. But the harder question, the one worth sitting with after the conference room empties and the folders get filed away, is not whether Adaeze was finally believed. It is how much of her work over 2 years and 4 months had already been proof enough sitting quietly in a system nobody thought to check long before anyone in a boardroom needed convincing. How many rooms are we all sitting in right now doing the actual work while somebody else prepares the slide deck? When the record finally speaks for itself, as it eventually did for Adaeze, whose name is the only one that was ever really on it, what will it say about the years before anyone thought to ask?